My name is Stephen Metcalfe. I'm a Member of Parliament for constituency about 30 miles east of here, and I co-chair the all-party parliamentary group for artificial intelligence with my colleague Lord Tim Clement Jones. Welcome to this, our sixth evidence session of our 2019-2020 programme, looking at various aspects of how AI is interacting and changing our daily lives, whether it's the way we work, the way we play, the way we live, the way we rest. It affects every corner of our lives. But today we are looking at how AI is being adopted within industry, how it can have the potential to transform organisations and the way organisations deal with their customers or clients. And to do that, we have a range of fantastic speakers who have joined us, who are going to take us through their various views. And I will go to each speaker individually. Each speaker gets 5 minutes. I try my very best to keep them to time, and I will be doing that when you get close to your time. 1 minute. Please try and keep it to 5 minutes. There are clocks in the corners of the screens just to help you. But obviously, I operate a little degree of flexibility because it is important that we hear what you have to say and don't just cut you off. But the tighter we keep that, the more time there will be for questions later. The only other thing is I have to say I have to leave at about 5 to 6. So I've got to go and sit on a delegated legislation committee, but I probably will only be 15 minutes or so, hoping so, and Tim will take over from me there. So, without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Tom Hadley, who is Director of Policy and Campaigns at REC.
Yes, thank you very much. So we are the professional body for the recruitment sector. In terms of background, the way we configure a lot of our work is along sectoral grounds. So we run 18 different sectors, anything from engineering, technology to healthcare to industrial, etc. So that gives us a good insight to what's happening across different sectors. Perhaps a good starter for 10 from our point of view would be some research we did a couple of years ago where we asked people, what is the most important life decision that you make? So is it whether to start a family? Is it what to study? Is it whether to get married? And the answer there was very clear. Is the biggest life decision we all make is actually the job and career that we choose to do. So I was going to talk about AI and how it impacts on the recruitment process and how we go about finding jobs, which is one of the most important things and most important life decisions that we make. So we welcome the debate. I thought I'd just spread it into three very quick sections. One is our overview of what's currently happening in terms of how organisations are changing and skill needs are evolving. Second, look at the recruitment sector itself. It's an interesting case study. How is our industry changing on the back of AI and some of the changes there? And the final section, just looking at recruitment procedures. So how is the way that companies in this country hire, how is it changing now, and how do we expect that to develop? So let's start with the jobs market. So we produce this every single month with KPMG, so our report on jobs has been going for 18 years. It gives a good insight into what the most in-demand jobs are, and there's definitely a correlation with the AI debate. So, for example, one of the biggest in-demand roles at the moment is automation testers. No surprise there. What is interesting, though, is the number of jobs on here you'd expect to start disappearing, which are still high-demand roles. So credit controllers, things like clerical staff, exec assistants, call centres. So there's a lot of jobs here we thought by now we would be seeing that disappearing, and it's not. So I think it was a bit of a reality check for us, actually, a lot of these areas, and let alone coming on to logistics and drivers, which we'll have a debate around in the next few years. So again, we are happy to contribute our data as we go forward, but it gives us a monthly health check in terms of what jobs are coming online and what jobs are perhaps becoming less in demand. So that's our take on the jobs market. In terms of the recruitment sector, 100,000 people work in the recruitment industry. But our industry is changing like many others are, certainly in terms of back office. So if you speak to our members in terms of running lean operations, losing some of those back office roles is a definite trend, the same as we see in financial services. Temp staffing is increasingly technology driven. So again, how that reflects in our industry is interesting. So new skill needs coming on board. A massive leadership challenge actually in our sector, not dissimilar to other sectors. So if you're running a recruit business, it's changing. The 360-degree recruits, we used to call it, gone, finished. So now you're bringing in people for specific roles much more. So who's going to manage this relationship with this tech-driven platform? Who's going to manage our client relationships? So quite big changes within our sector. And in the main, it's about how can we harness new technology moving forward. And again, going back to that leadership challenge. So again, we've done some quite interesting research on the leadership question. Happy to share it. So what does AI and technology mean for leaders in this country? It's part of the work we do at the RSC linked to our Future Jobs Observatory. Final section was about the recruitment process. So on every stage of the process about how you hire staff, people are looking at different ways that you can do things, and AI is coming into the mix. From the very start, using AI to sort of preempt some of the availability of staff in particular localities and regions is we're starting to see a lot more of that. The job ads, the specs you put out. So using AI to look at the wording you use in every job advert. So there are things that involuntarily might be turning off different types of potential applicants. So that is being used. The initial sifting, again, a lot of AI and technology being used as that part of the process. Even the interview process. So some of you might have been to conferences where you get the old robot gets wheeled out. I don't know if you've seen that. It happens. So you've got the robot on stage doing the interview. People saying, are people going to stand for this? And they say, yes, people love it. Do they? I don't know. But it's even happening at that sort of stage of the interview process. And then further on, psychometric testing, etc. So every stage, there's innovation happening and things are starting to change. I think at this point, it's interesting to note there's a difference between permanent recruitment and temporary staffing. And in the temporary staffing, that's where we see some risk, actually. There's a lot of new apps, online platforms that position themselves, we're going to do all of this, we're going to take, it's all going to be driven through technology. Now, in this country, there's quite significant regulations on recruitment, including for temporary staffing. So if I'm a temporary agency, for example, I have to make sure that anybody I place, I've checked out the employer. Is there any health and safety risk? I have to make sure that I'm checking the details of the individual. Are they legally entitled to work in this country? Are they able to work illegal? So that's one of the risks that we think. So how do we make sure that government policy, public policy reflects some of these changes, but also we reflect the fact that there's regulations in place around recruitment that are there for a reason, and we do need to make sure that any sort of AI-driven platforms reflect that necessity.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. I think that was a comprehensive canter through some of the issues. I suspect there may well be questions that come up, I won't preempt them, but around how to ensure that it is an equitable and fair system that doesn't have unintended inbuilt bias based on the learning data, but we'll come back to that, I think. Right, our second speaker, a regular attendee anyway, is Maria Exante. Is that right? Exante. Who is the AI program driver at PwC. Maria.
Coming from PwC, being a professional services and a corporation, obviously we see the story of AI in its full complexity. And I think what we want to highlight over and over again, on one side, that we need to demystify AI, understand what AI is capable to do right now, but also understand when it's landing in any organization, what's the impact it's going to have. And not just the impact it's going to have, but also how to best manage, so that on one hand, we are fostering the benefits that AI promised to bring, but also be able to be on top of the risks. Like every year, we run a CEO survey around the world to understand the reality in big corporation, and to no surprise, we've heard from our CEOs that 85% believe that there is a lot of potential in AI, but only, not big surprise, 6% of them will have large scale or scaled AI within the enterprise. In between those two elements, there is a long journey, so we're not moving as fast as some have thought, let's say, 2 years ago. But today I want to focus the attention on, first, the complexity of the story of AI and how to best address it in a structural manner, and secondly, about the role of the CEO and the leadership in driving it towards an outcome. The 5 pillars of AI adoption cover more or less the following elements. One is the structure. Our organization prepared to manage AI from a focal point, being a center of excellence, as we have, and part of that center of excellence, or innovation team. So what is the actual department that manages all AI-related enterprises? The second big pillar is about people, and when we talk about people and employees, it's not just about upskilling and about the ability to be data scientist or citizen scientist, but their role in understanding how job automation will impact how their well-being and their performance as employees. The third pillar, I would say equally important, is trust. We've heard so much about the trustworthiness of AI and how AI or autonomous systems should have value system embedded in it. But we also have a huge problem because the value system around the world are very different from culture to culture, from industry to industry, and so forth. And with that in mind, I think each organization developing AI needs to consider a role of responsible AI and addressing values and being able to govern AI in a end-to-end holistic manner. The fourth important pillar is obviously data. We do know that data strategies is very important to harness the AI benefits, but there's another element of data which I think it's somehow underlooked, which is the data that's dormant within the enterprise and can unlock a lot of values. And how can you be creative with that data? Not just preparing, label it, but be able to say, if I have this data in the system, how can creatively combine it to create new opportunities rather than just use data to solve problems? Disruption or monetization with AI, which means how do we not just optimize processes, but also how do we create value using AI? I think it's an important element. Startup and scale up shine in this domain, but corporations have a bit of a struggle to do that because of their complexity. And lastly, integration with other technologies. AI loves being integrated, so why not looking at how to best foster various technology, not just AI. The second part, which I will speed up a little bit because we don't have that much time, is the role of the leadership. And I think in fostering AI benefits, leaders have probably the most important role. And I'm talking about the decision makers. They could be the C-suite, they could be the decision makers in the middle management, but having them on board, having them educate and being able to understand the art of the possible for AI, being able to build a shared vision with AI that not just unlock the benefits, but keeps an eye on real risks. And when we talk about real risks, we're not talking about Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking type of risks around robots are going to kill us or take our job, but we talk about security risks or performance or economic or social that needs to be accounted. And probably one point that Tom and I have discussing earlier is that we need to have the workers and employees part of the transformation, being able to listen to their point of view when we start automating their job, because I think the conversation about job automation needs to move from a blindless job automation to a job augmentation, when both employees and technology work together to deliver value. And lastly, my last point is around AI ethics. AI ethics have had so much visibility in UK in the last 2 years, and we are now moving into implementing it. But we need to have a strategic stance on AI ethical principles. We've had it with corporate and business ethics. Now we have to have the same approach, so that we have not just the buy-in, the support of the leadership, but also be able to implement and permeate AI ethics throughout the organization. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Spot on time. Some interesting points there that I will maybe try and pick up a little later on one of them. Right, we move on. Chris, welcome. Chris Brower, who is Director of the MSc in Management of Innovation at Goldsmiths University. Chris, welcome. 5-6 minutes from you, please.
Great. Well, yeah, my pleasure to be here. I'm Director of Innovation at Goldsmiths, University of London, but I spend a lot of time on the front lines of organizations going through the transformations that you're discussing here, dozens of organizations in the UK. And so this is a kind of dispatches from the front lines, as it were, to share some of the experiences that we've had observing that. In particular, I want to speak to a collaboration I've had recently with Microsoft. We conducted a 6-month research investigation involving in-depth mixed methods process, case studies, social experiments, quantitative research, in-depth interviews with leaders within organizations. And we compiled all those results, and we learned some quite interesting things, similar to what we just heard. 48% of the organizations we looked at organizations with over 1,000 employees here in the UK. So 48% of those are currently experimenting with AI. 8% of them are scaling in the UK, and 31% of them not using AI at all in their operations. That's up about 10% on experimentation and 2% on scaling from last year. The number of companies with an AI strategy has doubled from 11% to 24%. We're seeing a big desire for organizations to be recognized as innovators in this field and to connect themselves with the reputation that the UK is developing as a top 5 market globally around research and entrepreneurship and indeed government regulatory and leadership in this area. There's 3 key areas that we ended up aggregating the results across. The first one was looking at this notion of what it takes for organizations to move from a state of experimentation to implementation, for them to scale their investments in AI across the organization. We found in our study, using a variety of objective financial measures, that organizations that were implementing AI were outperforming organizations that didn't have AI in the study by 11.5%. That's aggregate across a variety of measures, but that was 5% last year in the same methodology. We recognized last year that organizations needed to get on the bus and get involved with AI. And the second area we looked at considerably was the notion of moving from a culture of participation to one of democratization. So how can we see employees as active agents in organizations that feel empowered, that feel like they too have access to these technologies, that it's not something that's being done to them, but rather something that's being done with them. And to that end, we looked at this idea of balancing out the opportunities that organizations face with the responsibilities that they have in implementing these technologies. And we started with a basic premise of, and this is driven by a philosophy that Microsoft actually brought to the table initially, which is we need to ask the question, it's not what AI can do, but what it should do. And that we need to be able to distinguish between those things. So not to get too carried away by the capabilities of the technologies, especially in immediate applications of optimization and efficiency, particularly looking at cost cutting and work displacement and replacement in many cases as an immediate ROI and investment opportunity, but rather looking more broadly to creating a culture of continuous learning. There's been a great reduction in the public dialogue around the notion of reskilling human employees in organizations. I don't think we're talking about skills at all here. I think it is a culture of continuous learning that needs to be implemented. We talk about adult learning and the need to be able to transition from your education formally within educational institutions to an ongoing platform to learn and adapt your professional skills and practices so that you can also learn and adapt to the opportunities that the marketplace presents itself. And I think it's, from the research, it turned out to be highly reductionist to discuss the idea that somehow there was a whole class of a lump of labor that was potentially useless or not able to contribute meaningfully to the economy because of the significant challenge initially of reskilling these workers and transferring them into new jobs. And that migration opportunity is a big one and a big challenge, but we have the opportunity now, and you particular as parliamentarians have the opportunity to establish a framework here in the UK that would enable the next generation of the workforce to be able to adapt to this through this investment in education and the promotion of democratization and the notion of each individual being an active agent in the economy as much as they are in our political sphere. Lastly, we looked at diversity and inclusivity, so making AI work for everyone. This was a tremendous challenge, but we found some fascinating things. I'll just give you one brief example. So, when people talk about bias in organizations and the potential of AI systems to introduce bias into the organization, in our study, particularly in the in-depth case studies, we found that it was actually the technology itself that was providing the opportunity to reveal and make visible these biases that existed within organizations. So you'll hear a story often, say, an organization that's using an HR system to recruit and it's heavily biased against female candidates, and therefore they shut down the system. That's a high-profile case study, for example. What we learned in those cases, what actually it's doing, of course, it's a supervised learning system that's looking at historical data in that organization. So what it's doing is revealing and making visible patterns of bias and potentially discrimination that have existed in the practices of the organization historically. And by doing that, it's somehow being identified as the culprit, as it were, for revealing the truth of the matter. And interestingly, and this is the data I would share in conclusion, so of our advanced communities, 77% of them felt they had the ability to identify bias in their organization. That was compared to only 24% of the organizations that didn't invest in AI. So that first question is, can we see the bias? 77%, this is not just in AI systems, this is across the organization. But the next one, which was more interesting, was, are we putting in place steps to take action on it? Do we understand the steps required to address the bias? And again, there was an enormous gap. Those companies that were advanced in their AI applications, because they were being stress tested and demanded to respond to this, and they weren't hiding this and shuffling it under the carpet, but rather confronting the issues that were made visible to them, 68% of them understood the steps required to address bias, whereas only 31% of experimenters even saw that capability available to them. So the idea that you need to expose yourself to this and to experience it speaks to the idea of what the challenge is going to be to operationalize ethics here in the UK.
Chris, thank you very much. I think there was a lot of information in there. Hopefully I'll be back to quiz you on some of that afterwards, but for now I'm going to hand over to my co-chairman to carry on, and I will be back. I just want to point out there are a couple of seats around if people are finding themselves awkward, and of course please feel free to move down here as well and spread out. Tim, I'll leave you to it.
Thank you
I'll be
very
back.
much, Stephen. And thank you for quoting one of our long-standing members, Chris. Margaret Bowden coined that phrase about it's not what AI can do but should do. So until recently, she was one of our most regular attenders. So it's very good to know that she's one of our kind of leading people being quoted, because I often use that quote as well. Right, okay, we'll move on to Richard Cimento, who is both the founder and the CEO of Rialto. Richard.
Thank you. So I'd just like to introduce myself and Rialto, and then share with you the main evidence that my comments are going to be based on in terms of the development of AI as we see it, and then some recommendations for organisations, parliamentarians and individuals. In terms of my own experience at Rialto, I've spent over 28 years now in leading specialist teams to help individuals to learn more quickly than ever and reskill for what is a very changeable marketplace. In total, we've assisted now as a firm well over 500,000 people at all levels to face up to the career questions that they are challenged with, and to adapt and adopt various skills that the new marketplace is seeing. In terms of our main evidence, what we're finding in our research and work with these individuals, and I'm actually in meetings with people literally every other day in our firm, is we're finding the pace and progress of AI and the automation of work is almost progressing at an exponential rate. And for us, there's never been a greater time of promise or peril. And in terms of AI investments this year, as probably we're all aware, more has been invested in AI in the first 6 months of this year than the whole of last year, and similar records have been set around the world. In the last 4 years, according to Gartner, there's been a 270% increase in firms implementing some form of AI, and we're finding that these are having implications on the work that we do with organisations and with individuals. And there is emotion around AI, and hence the quote that we're all aware of from Stephen Hawking that is warning that full AI could spell the end of the human race, which creates some of this emotion that we're all having to contend with. But the competitive pressures, as we see it in terms of discussions with our clients, is driven out by research from the year 2000 from Accenture that half of the Fortune 500 companies have disappeared or been merged together because of the lack of embracing digital transformation of one kind or another. And we're finding organisations we're working with are afraid of being left behind and beginning to adopt and increase the adoption of AI. You're probably aware that there's a warehouse opened in Dubai this year that comprises 27,000 orders with the employment of only 40 staff. In a typical warehouse in the UK, the staff that's been employed is 600. So our worry is that the system that currently exists will actually displace more jobs than perhaps most of us believe, and it will have more difficulty in absorbing the need for reskilling those people to take up other roles in society. And some research around it is last year a record amount was invested in robots in industrial settings of 16.5 billion. The impact of that is work is being automated at a phenomenal rate, and just one or two figures around it. The World Economic Forum are quoting that by 2022, 75 million jobs worldwide will be displaced and will create 133 million new ones. The University of Oxford is quoting 47% of workers in the US are at high risk of jobs being replaced by AI and automation. And PwC are quoting 38% of jobs in the US and 30% in the UK are at a high risk of disappearing. And there's various other sources that I'm sure we're aware of that creates a picture of the increasing pace of change and the adoption of AI and the automation of work and the impact on workforce. In terms of reskilling, Deloitte are quoting that 55% of employees in the UK will require reskilling within 3 years. And IBM are quoting by 2022, 120 million people worldwide will need to be reskilled. So are we facing one of two different scenarios in terms of the adoption of AI? And that is, there's a wonderful life of leisure facing most of us when robots will do all the work, or the robots might take away our jobs and livelihood. And I think the reality is going to be something in between. The work that we're doing is involved in helping individuals that find themselves out of work as a consequence, generally by technology. And the research there by McKinsey's is between now and 2025, the proportion of humans doing a job will reduce from 71% today to 48% by 2025. So we'll probably find in all of our jobs that we're dealing with and adopting some form of AI to help us to do the particular work that we're doing. There's a slight comment I want to make here about the AI and automation in terms of research from the US Federal Reserve Bank as well as research from Hayes. AI, it seems, is having an impact on stagnating wages and reward. According to Hayes research, one extra robot per 1,000 workers could lower wages by 5%. So in terms of continuing with Hayes research, the mismatch indicator that some of you may be aware of, they record the skills required by organisations in the future and the skills contained by the current workforce, and that has got the greatest mismatch recorded since records began in 2012. So we're finding in our work that there's a greater gap between the average skills of the average worker and the skills required for the future job in the marketplace. The main problem that we see is there's a mismatch of speed between the adoption of AI, the disruption created, and the displacement in jobs, and the ability of the system to reskill those people and reabsorb them to good effect in the marketplace. So recommendations, at an organisational level, what we'd like to suggest is organisations appoint a C-suite director responsible for reskilling the workforce and make investments in that reskilling imperative. The second, maybe picking up what Chris said, is there's an ongoing lifelong learning imperative whereby people need to unlearn how we've learned in the past and learn new skills for this future, and that learning is going to be much more continuous. And the second recommendation for organisations is more investment in chief learning and skills around people that can help the workforce to adapt in these faster moving times. Some recommendations for government and parliamentarians, Tim. I think there's we need to do more study on the economic and social implications of AI and the impact of AI on displacing workers and the need for reskilling. There's quite a fragmented picture of contradictory evidence I've referred in some part. Maybe we need to think about taxing robots and taxing the adoption of AI, something that Bill Gates has quoted in the past. Perhaps a legal obligation on company directors to reskill workers affected by the adoption of AI or the AI being used in robots. And we need to somehow generate some funding to pay for reskilling. There was a quote in the Daily Telegraph some months ago. It's going to cost the UK government 90 billion, it seems, to retrain 1 million workers that would be affected by the reskilling requirement in the next 10 years. There's currently a trial in Liverpool of reskilling employees, and that perhaps should be looked at in more depth to see what we can learn from that particular trial. At the individual level, the recommendations that we'd like to suggest is, coming back to what Chris has said, each individual take responsibility for their own career, their own learning and their own life path. And the research around that indicates that if individuals do that in the context of the workforce, the organisation improves in terms of performance, innovation and growth. And stay curious and stay innovative, and as an individual, be more curious and be more aware of what is happening and take actions. MIT research indicates that people are now thinking more around where their career could go over the next 10 years and taking actions now to adapt.
Thank you very much indeed. No, had some really interesting points at the end there too, which took us on a little bit further. Over to Justin Anderson now, who's an associate at KPMG, advising private equity houses and corporates during deal life cycles on the value creation opportunities and risks that digital presents. Justin.
Yeah, last but not least, thank you, Tim. My role is to focus on how do we work out what the value of data or algorithms that a company holds might do to its share price. I don't know if anybody's looked at Tesla's forward PE rating. It's about 50. GM, Toyota, and the others around 6 to 7. Is there a correlation there with the fact that this is a company that has absolutely adopted AI at heart? So the opportunity for AI in the UK is forecast to be in the order of £630 billion by 2035. So we might be able to fund some of the retraining from that upside. And I think that's the key, is how do we get that value? So my point today is very simple. We have to empower middle management. And middle management is often left out of this, and they're often the ones that ultimately are rather scared about the prospect of AI. It's only going to accelerate. We know the reasons for that, but the successful outcome of the transformation of companies through artificial intelligence is increased productivity, and it's increased efficiency of human capital, feedstock and financial capital. Now, it's obviously that efficiency of human capital that is the worrying bit if we can't find the right ways of reskilling. It's very rare today to have any discussion around AI without talking about security, ethics or privacy, and the reality is a lot of focus has been on how to protect us as individuals, but there has been a lot less done on frameworks around how to actually adopt AI into the enterprise. And ultimately, though, AI's value will only be realised if we have the right leadership and we have the right way to implement it. And if we think about how AI comes into the organisation today, it's either coming from the bottom up, data scientists experimenting, it's coming from the outside in, technology companies that perhaps are even just putting the AI into our everyday technology already, and we're carrying it into meetings with us, or it's coming from the top down. We see CEOs who ultimately might not understand the nuances of AI, but they are absolutely leading the charge for digital transformation. So we've got the bottom up, we've got the outside in, and we've got the top down. What happens in the middle? How do we cope with that? And the truth is that middle management today is struggling. They struggle from communication, they struggle from their understanding. So we have to focus on being able to help middle management cope with that mess in the middle there. So how are they going to do that? Well, they have to sharpen their pencils. They have to sharpen their commercial pencils around what AI means. They have to sharpen their data and AI pencils, and they have to sharpen their overall management pencils. So let's just look at some of the ways they could do that. So sharpening the commercial skills. First of all, they've got to get out of the functional silos. AI is great, cross-functional, where we can get across the value chain, we can create real value. If you're stuck in the silo, it's difficult. Middle management need to be able to provide clear benefits, statements around AI so that senior leadership understand and can prioritize the investment. And all too often, the message gets lost in the middle there. They also need to be able to work out how to promote the investment into the right areas and cut investment in the wrong areas, effectively thinking more like a VC than an annual budget holder. They have to sharpen their data and AI knowledge. That starts with just embracing data inside the company, but also understanding all that open data that it sits around the company and how that might be able to help to build out AI algorithms to be able to support the business. They have to understand the individual use cases that sit underneath the business and understand how that is going to impact those processes. They also have to sharpen their management skills. They have to operate at the same speed as software developers. They've got to be agile. They've got to use tools like Kanban and sprints in order to be able to drive through the changes. This is a complete re-education of many middle managers to start thinking in a way that will allow them to unblock these sorts of problems that they need to be able to, if we're going to drive this successfully. They also need to be able to manage bots side by side with employees. Remember, machines need processes, people need passion. And they have to balance that innovation agility with well-governed industrialized processes and speed up the lag between research and scale out of adoption. So how do we do this? Well, to empower the middle, we need a national framework of good practice that demystifies artificial intelligence and provides a structured approach to scaling it in enterprises. Now, there was a recommendation of Dame Wendy Hall's report, Growing the Artificial Industry in the UK, which many of you will be familiar with, and the report recognised the need for an industry-wide group of stakeholders, a UK AI Council, to develop an information framework that provides practical guidance in the adoption of AI. These recommendations were focusing on the skills for senior leadership and didn't look at middle management, first of all. But the UK AI Council is now up and running, launched, supported by DCMS and BIS. They had their first meeting last month. And the officials and council members are highly esteemed, but they are primarily comprised of government officials and academics, and there is only one enterprise that sits on that board, Ocado. If we want to create an AI framework that's applicable across multiple sectors with an approach to governance, commons, standards, understanding the enablers and the blockers, industry has a much larger part to play. We need a market-led consensus approach. We need to establish best practice standards that drive transformation and performance improvements through agreed processes. Leadership's top-down approach, data science's bottom-up approach, must meet to empower the middle and create a fresh flow of innovation to prioritise and manage. This framework could unlock our potential to deliver that £630 billion as we head into a slightly uncertain future. But worse, if we don't do this, there's a genuine fear that the middle will quickly become irrelevant. And if we fail to be successful here, in the outcome of capitalising on this opportunity the future doesn't look so great. Thank you.
Justin, thanks very much indeed. Well, I must say we've had a very interesting mixture of presentations there, but actually there are some very common themes, and I suspect that every single one of our speakers has used the word leadership. I mean, what is entirely clear to me is we're not talking about the future anymore, we're talking about the here and now. There are opportunities, but those opportunities are being taken now, and the big question is whether or not we have the right leadership at whatever level, and I take Justin's point about middle management entirely, whether we have that, because the number of issues that leadership at whatever level has to deal with are considerable. I mean, the whole area of skills and reskilling, which a lot of our speakers have spoken about, the narrative issue, the trust issue, the democratisation need, the demystification need, and then the whole inclusion and diversity agenda. And also Richard, I think, got into the area of the kinds of things that would be appropriate for regulators, legislators to think about in terms of taxation, corporate governance, compulsory levies for reskilling. And then, of course, we heard at the very beginning about, on the recruitment front, whether there should be new employee rights or whether actually they were properly catered for in that sense. What I didn't hear, and I did hear from Chris to some degree, this question about the choices that are made about how AI is actually used, because it seemed to me that there are choices about whether you use AI in an augmentative way or in a substitutional way, and I think that kind of ethical approach is something that, again, whether or not we have the leadership to do that, to think through those issues, wasn't entirely clear to me. And what skills? I mean, we heard a little bit about the kinds of skills that are needed for the future, but I don't think that's entirely clear. Justin, I think, got closest to it, talking about commercial skills, but surely it's also skills in terms of critical thinking, creativity, which I know a lot of the tech industries are focusing on quite heavily. And I thought that it was very interesting, finally, that having set up the AI Council, that doesn't seem to have the right mix of representation on that, which I think must be a concern if there's only one business on the AI Council, when it was set up ostensibly with the idea of connecting business to government on AI policy issues. So I think there must be something there. So I'm going to basically throw it open. Chris, I don't know whether you want to open the batting with your usual forensic style, and then we'll throw it open, and we've got a number of parliamentarians, and I'll give them the first crack if they're still here. Otherwise, I'll throw it open to the room.
Thank you very much. And for all of you who are not yet convinced about the power and the potential of AI, you won't have realised that we already are in the midst of a parliamentarian bot in our chairman here today. That's just how good it is, but also to show the risks of it. When the bot was trained, it wasn't meant to go and sit on the Liberal Democrat benches. So still a way to go.
It shows what good foresight they have.
I'll kick off with a couple of quite practical issues, if I may, which I'm happy for anybody to take. I think a really important point that was made was around how do organisations, and in that I really think that the most significant organisation is indeed government, aka the Whitehall departments. How do we get this dormant data? How do organisations best go about understanding where that dormant data is and how to really get a grip on it and make it really useful for them? And the second really operational point is, what kind of target operating models do you think organisations need to be looking at and considering to really enable this to be seen in the context of the overall organisation and culture? Anybody can go first, but I'll ask Justin.
Oh, thank you. So first of all, the dormant data. I'm currently spending a lot of time looking at data sources that we can use to be able to support our due diligence processes. And that allows us to be able to go out and pull in data from the Office of National Statistics on one side, being able to look out across webs, blogs, Twitters, other feeds that allow us to be able to pick up a general picture. We can look at 1.4 trillion posts and analyse that for sentiment. There's huge amounts of data sources that are out there in this broad, open data space. And when I say open data, that some of, I'll include the data that's available to us to license as well. It's open source. So, there's a lot out there, and I think that often the opportunity is to be able to work out how to use that data and combine it with information that you might know about an enterprise, the customer or the supply chain, or the risks that sit all the way through that value chain. And combining that information, which might be combining weather information to give me insights into predictions about demand that will let me work out where I want to be able to how much I'm going to store of this stock, and also then pass that information through the supply chain itself, which is important. So there's a lot of that. In terms of the target operating model, obviously that's a big question, but for me, I think what's critical is that the IT function, which has been traditionally very siloed, is there to recognise that it needs to support the entire business in order to deliver whatever proposition it's delivering at market speed. And that is a complete reorientation of the IT function, with a focus on data as an asset to be able to monetize and make most of. And in terms of then how that flows through into overall value, how do you recognise the potential for data and machine learning algorithms to add value to the stock price? You're going to have to email me and have a chat. Those are the things we're working on.
I mean, you don't do that sort of thing for free?
There might be a cup of tea on it.
Yeah, he needs an engagement letter.
Very good. Thank you.
I would want to add what Justin said about data, the dormant data, and the value that sits unlocked is that we have to go back to what we've been advising our clients. You have to have a data strategy. You can't run, hide. You have to be honest about it. It has to be holistic. It has to start digging where the data lies anyway. I was a big concern when on one of the events I heard some CDOs, big banks, so large organization with a high maturity in adoption of AI, saying that they only start digging to understand what the data is in case of a cyber attack. When they are in the crisis room, they look at each other, is it your data, my data, or whose data is? To me, it kind of shows the messiness that is in the enterprise and needs to be sorted in order for us to be able to go to that scale of AI. And secondly, target operating model, that's an interesting one, has been bedazzling a lot of organizations since digital transformation. And I think probably the first word that keeps in mind is agility. We have to be able to play with different structures. Sometimes you need to have a center of excellence because you need to focus probably the skills, the highly desirable skills like data scientists to be able to advise and work with different lines of service. But sometimes you can boost innovation. Definitely, I totally agree with Justin on reinventing IT. IT as a function has been not in the conversation of AI. We are just now hearing the fact that, we need DevOps, we need various other technology to make AI work, to be able to scale. Hence, let's bring IT in the room. And yes, some people dislike it when our colleagues said that AI is IT, but ultimately AI is a technology. So let's use what we've learned from the computer science and the science of IT and make it work, because there's a lot out there. And that's how you build confidence, acknowledging what you have and being able to reuse it in the world of AI.
I'm going to bring in Tom in a minute, but I just wanted to challenge you slightly there, because you may want to bring in the IT function, but surely the accountability in this area is really important, that the board or the CEO actually do really understand the implications of what they're doing in terms of AI. This isn't a matter of just delegating to the CTO or the CIO or whatever, is it?
I completely agree, and I think there is a or a long backlog from digital transformation where business and IT supposed to get along to understand each other and empower. So when we talk about leadership or new types of leadership, is exactly that, acknowledging there is a new type of accountability with autonomous system that has to be shared, and who is accountable for in specific cases needs to be very clearly, specified, and that's where the AI governance kicks in. Because in AI governance you develop an internal AI policy where you develop roles and responsibility. Might sound simplistic, but it actually helps clarify where you draw the boundaries. And totally agree, you don't delegate this because it's far too important. But also what's also missing is an acknowledgement of the impact on AI on users. I don't think we speak enough about it. We don't prepare data scientists to have that analysis up front, and there's not enough acknowledgement within the community that we need to be estimating the impact of AI on various stakeholders, including users.
Tom, you I think wanted to come in, but it was quite interesting. You seemed to think, or seemed to be implying that employees were quite relaxed about the use of AI in recruitment and so on. I mean, some of us looking at that would think, if they're making a judgment when I'm being recruited, I'm not sure I like the sound of that, but maybe I'm just old-fashioned.
It's a good question. So that's, I think, goes back to your point. So we do have to preempt how consumers and individuals are going to respond to different procedures. I think there's a lot of trials happening out there, so nobody's quite sure how it will pan out. What is true, though, is certainly in recruitment, that's why our overall assessment is the need to build relationships remains key, actually. So it's not just about using AI, it's about harnessing it rather than using it to replace the personal touch. And again, we go to a lot of these events, and a lot of tech firms are very interested in recruitment. It's a great market to come into, but it is and always will be a people-driven agenda. So we think there's a balance to be struck. I think there's a broader agenda in our sector and other sectors is where do you go for information? If I'm a business leader in recruitment, as in other sectors, there's so much stuff out there. Where do I go to help make sense? So I think there's a role for representative bodies. There's a role for peer-to-peer networks where you can exchange views about what works, perhaps what doesn't. But the point I made around... What does that mean? The point
always good to get feedback.
Yes, sorry. But the general point, I think, is for individuals, there is a new generation coming on, but who might be very happy to apply for jobs purely online and go to an assignment having not seen anybody. And I think that's where there's a role for policymakers, because there's some risks in that. So some of the platforms that we see emerging, online apps for recruitment, they try and join REC as a recruitment, and we look at it and say, this is not a compliant business. It's not, because of checks. So I think there is something about just because it's tech-driven and it's innovative doesn't necessarily mean it's right, and I think that's one of the challenges policymakers have.
It's really interesting, because the word trust hasn't passed your lips, but you're clearly conscious of that as an issue.
Yeah, there's trust, and that's one reason. I mean, we're quite proud to represent the recruitment sector. So the recent survey by FIFO said 90% of people who go and speak to a recruitment professional trust that individual. Yeah. So what's happening in the jobs, etc. So that's what we have to offer, and again, it's about harnessing AI and new technology rather than seeing it as something that's going to completely replace, that individual personal touch.
Yes, it is augmentative rather than substitution.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to come in on this, Richard?
Yes, thank you, Tim. Just some comments about the target operator model in terms of our experience over the last decade or so. Most organisations are moving from siloed, structured systems into a system that is much more fluid and more agile, with teams being created to solve particular projects, customer-facing projects of one kind or another, and then supported on the left-hand side with talent and the gig economy, hence the comment that Thomas made about platforms. Many of our clients are using platforms to draw into that organisation gig economy talent, and they're employing less full-time people in the projects we're involved with. On the other side, AI is increasingly being used, work is being automated at a phenomenal rate, and just a bit of evidence over the last 10 years in terms of the number of jobs in the UK paying around 100,000. That number of jobs in the UK is reduced by circa 30%, which is about 1 million jobs have been taken out of the system at that senior level as a consequence of the competitive pressures and the further adoption of AI and other technologies. Essentially, most of our projects are focus on clients that are generating a smaller organisation but more tech-savvy people, and hence the reskilling imperative.
But then you don't sound. It sounds to me as though you think those million jobs being taken out are actually, new jobs are being created, and
not at a senior level, Tim. No, statistically, the ONS figures. If you do your research on that for anyone, I can send some information around to members of the group here. The number of people being paid 100,000 or circa 100,000 in the UK is reduced by circa 1 million at that level.
Okay.
The jobs have been taken out and not replaced. At the same time, the actual skill sets required to activate a leadership role is different today to what it was 10 years ago.
So there's going to be a gap. There's that middle management gap, in a sense, where you get the very highly paid and you get those. They've got a gap because those million jobs and 100,000 going. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm not sure quite whether we've even got to the point where we've got any kind of solution in sight. I mean, I know that Justin's going to train the hell out of middle managers, but I'm not quite sure.
I mean, if we don't, that million figure is going to seem like a drop in the ocean. Yeah. That's the reality. If that's a million at that level.
Yeah, I would only just add, in terms of parliamentarians' responsibility around this and opportunity that you guys will face moving forward. GDPR, presumably, if we move forward and sever ties with the European Union in that regard, then there'll be a big need here in the UK to develop and evolve meaningful data privacy standards and understandings around what sort of regulatory environment we want to lead. I've spent quite a bit of time in China over the last couple of years, and China and India are racing away from the rest of the world with regards to their ability to harness the power of the data at their disposal, largely as a product of the regulatory frameworks that they've developed to prioritize. They're quite significant, and they are able to police and regulate them to a level of granularity that we could only dream of here in the UK. But it is indeed the intention that they choose to prioritize the opportunities present in the potential relationships between data points that might not seem otherwise to have significance initially, and issues that start to emerge as we develop more and more complex ways of mapping our societies through data. And this concept of technologically mediated social engineering is a very powerful component of the arsenal of nations and indeed organizations that harness the power of that kind of approach towards data. So we have to recognize that it's going to be a trade-off that we are making in essence in terms of our ability to compete around this dormant data, the notion of what we do to connect together data, to create meaning in the data and to understand it, and our decisions to protect the individual privacy of users of that data, and whether the data can be connected back to personal data to recognizable sources and so on becomes a really, really big issue. If the intention is power of AI lies primarily in personalization and customization, if you don't allow for that level of granularity in the data that you can't see beyond the aggregate, then you're going to struggle to leverage the capabilities of these technologies in a really meaningful way, particularly as they advance significantly from here.
So what do you tell those who you advise? I mean, you set it out quite starkly in terms of more or less implying that we're going to, with GDPR, we're going to fall behind this great AI race. What's the answer?
Well, I mentioned the idea of the machine learning and the idea that, for example, our ability to recognize that those systems and their ability to learn and identify patterns is in many cases now already far superior to that of human beings. And if we harness them, begin to trust the power of those technologies to play those specific roles, you want your AI systems identifying bias. You want your AI systems analyzing X-rays. You want your AI systems performing functions that are accessing data points that allow you to understand people in a richer way. And I think if we develop that sort of trust rather than the fear that these technologies present to us, then we can start being a lot more strategic about how we make decisions around that balance between a blunt instrument of just privacy is sacrosanct and we must protect everybody's data in all regards, and a notion of actually, there's an awful lot of utility that can be driven by augmenting human beings with these technologies, and in that way a reciprocity between the technology and the people, sharing data across becomes an important strategic...
Isn't there a bit of a circularity here? Because to get trust, people have to be convinced that their data is being used ethically. I mean, for instance, things like facial recognition technology, government use of algorithms in the criminal justice system, things like that, where we know that a lot of those technologies at this moment are highly inaccurate. So how are we going to... I mean, if you start off on the wrong foot, how on earth are you going to get that trust? And in a sense, if you like, modification of GDPR rights.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the reasons we know that they're inaccurate is because we're generating the data back for them. If we can see that facial recognition systems, for example, have racial profiling characteristics and can be dangerous for... We learn that, and we can't put that system into production in a meaningful way until we begin to address some of those concerns. But if we don't stress test and pressure those systems to continue to develop and evolve accordingly, and instead we fear the notion that, well, they're obviously going to lead to racist tendencies in the decision making of this system, we have to recognize that in our societies right now, that's embedded in so much of what we do. There's masses of institutional discrimination going on. There's huge gender bias. 7 of the 100 CEOs of the largest companies in the UK are women. That sort of representation is not an accurate representation of the leadership of this society. And I think
if we got Tom's recruitment tools working properly,
pardon me,
we'd be in much better shape. Thank you very much. I mean, clearly we're already beginning to build some interesting debate here. Who'd like to open the questions or the comments? Yeah, gentleman there.
I'm middle manager at Justin's Road. I actually had a question for the...
I'll take 3 comments or questions, and then we'll put them round the panel, and then we'll go for another round.
I just wanted to get some sense from the group about some of the initiatives a firm could take to imbibe the culture of adopting AI, rather than what a middle manager should do or what leadership do. What are some of the culture levers a firm should apply to make sure that the firm is applying AI across this, or to imbibe AI in the culture of the firm?
Sorry, I didn't get all of that. You're saying it depends on the culture?
No? My question is, what are some of the initiatives the firm or leadership could take to imbibe or transform the culture of adopting AI at a firm, rather than saying that, let's reskill ourselves, let's do that. But, how do I change, as a middle manager, how do I change the culture of my team in going out there and adopting?
Okay, thank you. And then I want to get a more gender diverse group, actually, if humanly possible. I'll take that chap at the back, but then I'd like, yeah.
Some of the speakers mentioned about corruption with management, taxing robots, etc. Is therefore, with that in mind, a case for citizens' income in order to be able to provide consumer spending, so the robots have actually got something to sell to in the first place?
Thank you. It sort of starts getting back to the sort of things that Richard was talking about. And the third one, yep, I can't get diversity yet, but too bad, okay.
My name's Tony. Just a couple of things, if I may. In terms of recruitment, GDPR has got a safety net today, which is if you think a hiring decision about you has been made via an automated program, you can request for a human to do that for you. And that's the only safety net we have in law today. In terms of the skills and what automation is doing today, there are those people that believe that one of the main reasons for volatile political situation we have in the world is governments failing to help the average person on the street to take advantage of globalization, which the same thing could happen with AI. I mean, McKinsey recently, well not recently, 2 years ago said that up to 375 million skilled workers worldwide within 10 years would have to be retrained because their jobs would just not exist because something that is automated would be doing that. So what can we do with AI not to have the same failures that we have with a globalised world? Is there anything?
If you look at the photographs of Fifth Avenue between 1903 and 1913, quite stunning. How do we avoid that kind of complete change? Well, maybe we can't. I'm going to start with Chris, and then we'll go round that way.
So I'll just briefly speak to the first point around the culture. We ran a number of social experiments in our research here with Microsoft in this latest venture, and one of the things we learned from that was that the most effective intervention we had at our disposal was to expose workforces to the actual application of the technology in their day-to-day work. So if people have an opportunity to recognize that the AI system is highly likely to free up time for them, that is a very valuable commodity. It also promotes their opportunity to perform higher order tasks that they haven't had the opportunity to, that have been sitting in the drawer and this kind of a thing. So from a culture change perspective, one of the things we've learned is that, as quickly as possible, you want to pilot and engage your workforce with these technologies in a very specific way. So the way we did it was they co-create the future job after they get experience with the technology. So they start to recognize what the technology can do, and then we ask them to write their job description that was their dream job description that sort of met the ideal circumstances, and they started to recognize that that was in fact achievable if they augmented their role with these technologies. And we're typically very resistant at the start and embrace the technologies later on. So I think just getting hands-on is a key component.
Fantastic. Perhaps just on the first question and the third, how do you create a culture of innovation? Chris, I think you mentioned the work you've done with schools. I think it starts there, actually. So we've done a lot of work. So as a representative body, we see part of our mission is to galvanise our members. Let's go into schools and help build that bridge between education and the world of work. The encouraging thing is you go into a lot of schools now and they are talking about growth mindset and that attitude thing, and I think the message is getting across is it's not about linear careers, it's about being able to adapt to things as you go through. So becoming a genuine growth mindset nation, I think, plays to this agenda, but it does start quite young in schools, and we're starting to see some positive signs there. Then the third question I thought was a really interesting one. If you take a step back purely from AI, there is a fundamental challenge in this country about how we see our jobs market. We think we've got a good jobs market in the UK. Yes, we have. Employment figures record high. But a lot of people are still dissatisfied. So it's moving that debate away from just how many people are in work to how many people feel satisfied with the work and can progress in work. And I think partly there's new opportunities coming on board, so that becomes something that we can seize. But I think there is a big debate to be had of actually how do we quantify or define a brilliant, good jobs market that works for everybody. And part of that is responding to that feeling that, yes, I'm in work, but I'm not necessarily happy with my work. And part of that is progression.
We've heard about these million jobs in summer, cutting out at the £100,000 level. How immediate for you is that in the recruitment field?
So that's an interesting one. So as I said, we perhaps thought there'd be more signs in our official data that things. It is happening, and you pick up some anecdotal. Let's not forget most jobs are for SMEs, and it does take a while for that to permeate. So at the moment, there's a lot of jobs on our list of hard-to-fill jobs, which I wouldn't have expected to be still here at the moment. Yeah. The back office roles, etc. So there is certainly things happening, but it's perhaps not happening as quickly as some people might have thought a couple of years ago.
Interesting, but it could be just around the corner.
Things could move quite quickly. So I think one of the policy responses we need in this country, and so the Thomas Cook administration, one example of that is there will be sectors affected. So how do we create a sort of better mechanism to help people transition into new jobs, perhaps from whole different sectors? And I think that's an interesting policy debate that we're keen to feed into.
And that is a government intervention.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant.
In terms of culture transformation, we know that there's a long process. This has started in digital world, and I think we just need to build on that. And it has multiple angles, and it is very personal to each organization. Sometimes you need to upskill massively and invest massively in upskilling. We do it ourselves, but we start with basic digital skills. So what is agile, what is data, what's cloud computing, right? Because we're a bunch of accountants and consultants, so that's the reality. But also really like the point about exposure to AI, and I think that's where the leadership steps in, is how do we expose people to the possibility, the art of possibles, and expose them to what AI can do right now, and being able to work with them to demystify what AI is not, because we hear so much what AI could potentially do, but we're not quite there yet. And also, it's really important to empower workers to be part of the process. What Chris has said, and also what Tom was saying, is we have to give employees a voice. And although I'm delighted to hear what Chris was mentioning, I don't think I've seen this enough in cultural transformation, and we need to put it back on table. Bring the experts, the employees, the workers, not just the highly skilled, the middle management, but I'm talking about low skilled. What about the truck drivers? Or the ones that most likely going to lose their job in the next 10 years? Are they considered? Are the union involved at all? So I think we have to be starting that conversation. And on the topic of what happens in the future, I think public policy is the answer. Right? So I think we have to move away from the massive job automation and the fact that it seems that the narrative seems we've lost control. No, we haven't. Right? We have election coming in US, election in many countries. Public policy can address the issue of job automation, reskilling from a macro level. And also regulation. We need to start regulating some parts of AI, and very curious to see how new European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is going to approach this from a European perspective, but that sends a very clear message. We are here to operate some of parts of AI, including facial recognition. We're talking of biometric data, a data that once it's collected is gone. So how do we know what happens with that data that's so sensitive to us?
And she's promised to regulate within 100 days of the new commission. Now, we don't know what the regulation is, do we? Which is a bit
She
bit
has
strange.
a high-level expert group of 52 experts in the field, so...
Oh, well, we'll have to have a dialogue with them in that case. Richard?
Some comments, Tim, about culture. I certainly agree with the comments about encouraging the growth mindset and exposing the workforce to the emerging technologies. But in terms of our projects of transformation over the last probably 5 or 10 years, the successful organisations that have achieved that transformation have taken the fear away and guaranteed people that if they don't want to adopt the new skills, or they can't adopt the new skills, then there's a way in which a system could be put in place to help them develop the careers elsewhere. So I think there's that addition that is making the difference. I think the question from the gentleman at the back there, I'm intrigued about. The current evidence about AI and automation is stagnating wages currently. That's what the evidence is saying. And I certainly have a worry that with the adoption of AI and automation and more robots in industrial settings as well as AI in white-collar settings, will there be enough consumers with the money to actually buy what is being produced? And hence our view that there has to be perhaps some kind of intervention at the organisation level with a reskilling director and a learning director, and policy from government in terms of mandating organisations to actually help people to reskill and earn new livings. Otherwise, there's going to be more of an impact on society, and there'll be less of us that have, and the distribution of wealth will be more polarised.
Thank you. And then Justin.
Yeah, so firstly on culture. I mean, culture ultimately is going to be directly linked to how your leaders are making decisions. And if those leaders are making decisions with a certain level of risk, then that will encourage that throughout the organisation. If they're highly risk averse, like many audit firms, then that's going to have an impact on the organisation as well. The question is, though, the culture that you want to create is going to change for what reason? I think it's to retain and attract the employees that you want for the future of your firm, and the skills that they have, which if you look at the skills that World Economic Forum suggests are in fact the critical skills, they are exactly what Tim was talking about earlier: creativity, collaboration, the ability to solve complex problems. We need to give that to our employees. We need to give them the jobs that will allow them to be able to use their creativity and their critical thinking skills and create the culture that will attract that. In terms of many of those other jobs that might not fit into those categories, I think it is genuinely a big worry. We talked earlier about is this substitution or augmentation. There's a company called X.AI, which is essentially being able to provide you with a personal assistant, which is every bit as great as any personal assistant you might have ever had, and just never forgets anything, and will organise your meetings and be able to engage as a chatbot with somebody that looks as if it's a complete human. In fact, the reality is they've got an AI front end, but behind it, they've still got humans. So it is on a service. It looks like an AI service, but it is an augmented service. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, where we're just able to be more productive as a result of working with. Last point on the...
I knew you'd cheer us up, Justin.
Last point.
It's what consultants always do.
On citizens' income, I don't think we can afford it. Obviously, the World Bank's looked very carefully at whether or not there is a way of being able to fund this. But at the end of the day, we can't just print money. It's got to come from somewhere. Otherwise, we'll be like Argentina.
Oh, that thought. Birgitta in the next round, and then do I have another couple? Yes. Phyllis, yeah, and then I've got a third at the back there, because I think you had your hand up in the last round. So Birgitta, Phyllis, and then jump at the back.
So I went to both the political party conferences, both the one on Conservative and the one on Labour. I might join the Lib Dem next year again. I want to say that...
you better not sit too close to Chris.
She only said maybe, to be fair to him.
Of course, a major thing there was this thing of technology and also losing the jobs when people didn't talk about Brexit at the time. And the trade unions was there, and there was lots of meetings on it. One of the things which I think is underplayed, and this is the role of the gig economy, because it seems like there's no one official organization that has them as a stakeholder, so to speak, and neither does the trade union. And there's lots of studies coming out that the gig economy, so for America and the United States, that up to about 40% of the people in 2020 are part of the gig economy. And that is partly because of digitalization and, of course, artificial intelligence. Some of it is self-made, some of it is made redundant, and then you become a one-man, one-woman band. And I think that, and this comes into how we can, on the one side, it's not about completely jobs gone, but there's a lot of job tasks that's gone, and that has done that lots of these job tasks have now become outsourced, and people doing part of their job, because a part of the job is gone, then that job task is gone, or it's cheaper to get from outside. And I think a major thing we need to think this, I don't know what recruitment agencies are going to do, but that's one place that they could do a huge difference, organizing the gig economy, so not everybody's gigging alone, trying to alone look for a job. If it's very difficult to, there's no payment for a sick leave, there's no payment for training, there's no payment, they can't get a mortgage, they can do nothing. And if the gig economy become organized and you're using your technology in that fashion, then I think that's much better used than trying to poach unhappy people as we define in jobs. Because who's not unhappy sometimes at the workplace? So I think this is where that technology should be used, and this is where we can make a big difference. I don't think it's trying to match people up who are already quite fluent in the marketplace.
Okay, thank you, Birgitta. Good. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, you definitely far away.
I'd like to put in a plea for the consumer, the client, the customer, because it's all very well harnessing AI for processes, internal processes and innovation, but from the consumer's point of view, when they try and talk to any of the consumer-facing utilities, the NHS, banks, etc., it's utterly frustrating that you get a chatbot that really doesn't answer any of the questions that you want to pose to them. So I would like to put it to all the businesses around here to put a lot more effort into making it more consumer-friendly.
Press 2 if you'd like your question answered by Justin. Press 3.
Exactly. Well done. The back.
Yeah, there's a lot of points to be made around the explainability of AI at scale. A lot of focus of this is on automation rather than augmentation. I'd be particularly interested to hear about, particularly the corporate finance example that you gave, Justin, on how you can difference between the AI decision and the human decision, particularly in regulated fields such as fire.
Could you tell us your business or background or whatever?
I'm Harry and I'm a financial services technology consultant.
Right. He may have got a new client in that case. That's how it works around here. You know. Right. Let's start off with Justin.
Take any more, or just one question?
Take any ones that you feel like answering. You can avoid any question around here.
So to the regulatory one, how do you know what the decision is that's been made? And let me just clear something else up. So we talk about AI, machine learning, in the same breath as we might talk about automation and we might talk about regression analysis. And just trying to work out actually what do we mean by AI. I think it's not about those challenges that we can solve today with existing statistical techniques. It is that next generation that are typically sitting there within the world of neural networks. Now, the challenge with a neural network is that looking into it, it's sometimes very difficult to understand exactly how a decision was made. But there are opportunities and certainly in the regulatory environment, that is a great challenge, because if you don't know how that decision was made, then it becomes a problem. But there are backdoors into neural networks that allow you to be able to better understand it. But clearly at this stage, being able to manage certain types of data sets using neural nets is still very dangerous. And that goes back to computer vision as well, which is based on neural networks. Any of the facial recognition, but it is getting remarkably good very quickly. Every time I get my update of my iOS, it gives me another 1,000 photographs that it's recognised as somebody somewhere, even if they were, for 20 years earlier. It's extraordinary, and that will ripple its way through to the chat bot that actually does understand us when we call them up, so the consumers hopefully will be happier as well.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment on the regulatory side of it, but the question over here about chatbots and AI, I think my comment there is that the developments and disruptions of the industry is being driven by the millennials and Generation Z, who seem to want to interact more with technology, and hence we're finding more technology being in our lives. But I personally agree that there needs to be a balance for the human interface and human touch. I think we might go too far in one direction in terms of the technology, but I take Justin's point, and nevertheless the technology is getting cleverer and quicker and better, and probably all of us would agree that what we're receiving in terms of predictions and offers and suggestions based on AI is just getting better every week. Certainly my own experience.
Do you think that will have a big impact on public trust? I mean, will it have a virtuous aspect to it in that sense?
You know what, Tim? I'm not sure personally. I don't know what the other members of the panel feel. I'm not sure, but certainly trust needs to be present for us to believe in AI and trust it. And certainly from a personal point of view, the interactions I'm having with AI, I can trust, but maybe I'm just in a small group. I'm interested to see how many people in the room feel that they can trust the AI that they're experiencing.
Maybe we'll have a straw poll at the very end.
Yes,
Although it's a bit binary, isn't it, really? It will have to have black, white and grey, or something. Maria.
Try to address three questions, because I think what Brigitte said about gig economy is really important, and we are missing sometime a point about job automation and new jobs, what happens in the gig economy. But first, on the explainability in financial services, ICO and FCA are running now a project around explainable AI, just to understand based on various use cases and public consultation, where to draw the boundaries. So from our experience working with both ICO and FCA, for the ones who know the acronym ICO, it's the Information Commission Officer, FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, two of the most mature regulators, not just in the country but around the world. They're struggling to understand where to draw the boundaries and how to best regulate. So there's a lot of exploratory over there, and I hope that the European Union work around trustworthy AI will help boost the position of the regulators, but they are looking into it, again, with the perspective that a regulation should not stifle innovation. So they keep that in mind, but also be aware that they have to have a stance on some of the ethical principles like fairness and explainability, like they had in data privacy. On the consumer-friendly AI, excellent points, but we all know that Google, Amazon's, Alexa's, and all the other tech companies have set the bar so high. the number of assistants, smart assistants like Alexa or Google Home has set to reach 200 million PCs by next year, which means that if we are around assistants of that quality, we demand the same quality from every other assistant. And maybe should keep in mind that it's not always possible. Those companies are AI driven. Both Google and Amazon have some of the most pristine AI capability, and it will be difficult for companies in utility, for example, to have the same level. And lastly,
that's very interesting you say that. I still think they're pretty useless, actually. I mean, they're pretty stupid still.
I heard that, Jim.
But you think they're high quality. That's very
compare with the chatbots that are being used when you approach Vodafone and you try to understand what happened with your bill. Of course they are, but we still, I think they set the expectation high.
It's a low bar, though.
Try Sky's bot. Absolutely hopeless.
And then the last point with the gig economy, I think the unionization of gig economy is a must right now, because if we have been unionized all the rest of the jobs, we have to be able to do that. And I know, for example, Uni Global, which is part of the union of trade unions around the world, is actually looking into that. But I think that's, again, where public policy should help a little bit more and recognize the value gig economy brings to the country.
Great, thank you. Tom?
So just on that one, I think there's two forces of change. There's the technology AI agenda, and then there's the one about different working patterns. We believe partly driven by individual choice, but also by different business models, 24/7 society. So how those two interact, I think, is an interesting agenda and does require public policy response. Just to be clear, though, we don't represent the gig. So if you're working flexibly, you've got different options. If I'm an employer, I can get people in directly on 0-hour contracts, I can bring gig workers in, or I can use a recruitment agency to source that for me, and it's very different. There's been regulations on the recruitment industry since the early 1970s, so the regulations I was talking about are for recruitment businesses, recruitment agencies, and that's why the whole Matthew Taylor review was a good thing, because it was trying to bring gig economy in line with some of these other regulations. So we think that's going to be a constant, actually, making sure that public policy reflects different ways of working as well as a technology agenda. So I think that's an important point. There are some bodies, so IPSE represent individual contractors, for example, so there are some organisations there who do represent the individual workers who choose to work in that way. And on the consumer part, I think it's a great question, because I'm not sure. At the moment, the feedback from job seekers is actually when I'm going for a job, I like to speak to somebody, right? But in a few years, will it be normal? I'm very happy to go through a process. I'm not sure. My feeling is it's actually such a big life-changing event to find a job that there'll always be a need, to have some sort of personal contact. But I think it's a great question. It's worth looking at. Let's not forget some supermarkets are bringing people back into the tills in some countries. Yeah, some of the tests looking at NHS automation and that coming away from it because the people weren't ready for it. So I think we do need to keep an eye on what people really want. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. And then finally, Chris, you get the last word.
Well, I think those are fascinating trios. So the gig economy one, I think, is exactly right. We've seen how technology has evolved. You can draw down what you need. You pay only for what you use. I think, there are significant challenges to how the labor market might evolve in that way. But the commodification of labor, created a lot of issues with utility and productivity that I think the real opportunity around total value productivity and opportunities to use technology to enhance productivity in this country will come from the people and being able to make better use of the intellectual resources we have from our people in collaboration with the technology. So I think that's a fascinating model that I think is likely to evolve. On the customer side, the big challenge is triage right now. And so if you design a system to be efficient and just to displace your human call center with a chat bot, and you don't take into account the experience of the human being who's using that service, then it's likely to fail. If you consider instead, the sophisticated technology we have sent and announced, you can see the consumer is frustrated, move them over to a human being immediately, and be intelligent about that. I'm sorry, I can see you're frustrated. I'm going to hand you over to my human colleague, Alex. Then that's a much more sophisticated approach that we've seen work very successfully. And on the explainability challenge, I think that will grow. At the moment, it's a big issue within financial services. It's only going to grow and start to impact more and more industries as we start to take that on. And again, I think that's a design challenge. When we develop and implement these services, we have to recognize where it's possible now to use the technology and where we need to still rely upon human beings to perform those functions.
Great, Chris, thank you very much indeed. And can we thank our panel?